answer that automation is what is the question that automation is the answer for, how many of you feel it is the first answer for that? So if you raise your hands for traffic efficiency, is automation the first thing we should be looking at? If you raise your hands for safety, is it the first thing that you feel, or the most important thing that you feel it's looking at? How many of you feel that really it's something that is indispensable now to deal with the issues of traffic efficiency, of safety, and well, of market development? That may be the first thing. Do you feel it is the first answer, or do you think that we already have a lot of things that we can apply in these areas to improve safety, to improve traffic efficiency? Does anyone feel that automation is what we should be investing our attention mostly right now to deliver safer traffic systems and to deliver more fluid traffic flow? Anyone? Anyone? Okay. So we have a few. I mean, that is a complicated question. What do you feel? Where does automation fit into that spectrum of what policy has to deliver in all those areas now, and where might it fit in the future?
The beauty of not working for a city government anymore is I can actually say my opinion now. So I think it's a spectrum and an evolution. And I think when I worked in the city of San Francisco, we were bombarded by technology providers every day and different solutions that would come to us. And the first thing we'd ask is the why. You have to ask the why. What are we actually solving for? What's the problem that we're trying to solve for? And the answer would always be that it could be something else very quickly. So in my opinion, the evolution comes in phases. So if cities that are growing, and you know, the audience, just from meeting with the different folks in the teams, we all come from different continents, and so it's very important that we don't focus on the Northern European or the US approach, because that's one approach. The world is very diverse in terms of its approaches. So what works in San Francisco may not work in Mumbai and in Nairobi and so forth. So we need to really think of it holistically. And I think that comes with that whole process of evolution. Do you have a transportation system that is functioning today for you, for the things that you want in your city? Most people would say no. So the answer is, well, how do we get there? We get there in stages. So what are those stages? Do you have a safe way for people who are most vulnerable in your transportation system to get around? Are there sidewalks? Are there protected bike lanes? Because they're the cheapest ways to get around. Do you have dedicated lanes for transit so it can cut through the congestion and get there on time so people can use public transit and make it more viable and make it more effective? If the answer is I don't have any of these three things, then that's your priority. You need to focus on those and get those ready. Do you have, and then when you have more technology and resources, do you synchronize your traffic? Do you have your lights synchronized? Can you actually have the traffic actually move in a way that actually makes sense? And all of those things with like better crosswalks. So there's a whole menu of things that everybody's written about and everybody in this room has read about that are the fundamental building blocks of a safe, effective, efficient, and reliable transportation system. And then the next step after that is, how do we improve the performance of our system? And the improvement of the performance of the system requires network type solutions. Network theory principles that say that when we have a certain level of density of vehicle types, we can now move in a more effective and efficient way. And that's through connectivity, that's through some level of interaction and communication, and then we can switch modes. So for example, why ride-hailing has been working is because they've used an app to basically aggregate users and aggregate drivers to bring people to and from places. Automation takes it to the next level and can make that more effective and efficient because they don't need to park and they don't need to stop anywhere after they've picked up. They can go back into the system. The automation also helps with the network itself. A fleet of 1,000 or 2,000 vehicles can meet the needs of tens of thousands of people because of the constant reuse and approach. So as you can see, we're starting to layer this cake. I like cake. So you can start layering the cake, and all of a sudden you start seeing that you start putting in all the different pieces, and the automation is the icing that makes the whole cake actually work more effectively. And I think that's, if you look at it from that approach, it's an evolution of phases. And I haven't mentioned anything about the sharing. You know, obviously density of land use allows more shared services, whether it's bike share or car share or ride share. You need to exhaust those options in your city, and then you can start putting in all those other pieces into it. But they don't happen linearly in sequence. They happen in parallel. And so you can try and experiment and add and iterate, And I think that's the most exciting part about this question, is that automation forces the discussion now of, have we done our homework with everything else so we can bring in this new opportunity in?
In theory.
In theory.
Erwin?
Yes, I think in theory that's indeed true. I mean, if you look at how easy it is now to get an Uber or a Lyft car, um, it's an alternative to walking, to biking, to taking public transportation. So what it essentially does is put a lot more cars on the road. The question is, I mean, do we really want to go there? I mean, if you look at transportation, there was a beautiful system that was proposed by a Danish company back in the 1990s, and I don't recall the name, but it basically had, everybody had their own, or they could be shared, electric pods. And these electric pods were smaller than a car. You could move your stuff around, you could take it for the entire day. And then these would actually merge onto rails. So they basically had little wedges and they could ride up into a rail, turn into trains, go south. They costed it for the city of San Francisco, and it was actually cheaper than expanding the BART with extra rails and things like that. And the same thing in Copenhagen. It never went anywhere. But an environment like that, where you have these little pods that are shared, that can be fused, that way you have transitions into the larger ecosystem of transport, and you can travel larger distances. Because right now it's very convenient to go from your home to your office in a car, particularly because otherwise you'd have to walk, you've got bad weather, get into a public transport, et cetera, and particularly in the US, that's not really very well developed. Whereas if you look in places like Japan, where I've spent quite a bit of time, that whole public transport is extremely efficient. It's a bit inhumane. If you look at traveling in the Tokyo train system, that's definitely not something that I would wish anybody, because you basically, yes, it's efficient, but you're stuck there. You can't do anything. It's so tight you can't even look at your phone, because you have to look at it that way. But there are other alternatives, and I think it's all a matter of waiting until we have enough of this interest in autonomous mobility and interest in changing the infrastructure. And at that point, it goes really fast. I think right now we're at the point everybody knows it's happening, everybody sees it's coming, but we're not quite there yet. And
we're also at a point where it can go any which way.
Exactly.
Heinrich, you had something that you want to say, and then I'm going to switch to the second.
Yes, I need to be a little bit provocative, because I'm hearing very often we should. So from the industry point of view, yes, what do we want to achieve? We want to, everybody is interested in reducing stress while we are driving. Everybody is interested in reducing fatalities. Everybody wants, especially in big cities, reduce NOx, and so on and so on. So, what do we need to do? We need definitely a cooperation between industry and cities like you to enable this. There are a lot of cities who have installed some kind of autonomous driving test areas, but we need to go this way. The industry, at the end of the day, we have to make money. Without any business model, nothing will happen. So we have to focus on introducing these kind of systems. You as the city, you as the ministries, you want that we improve the traffic flow. You want that we have less stress while we are driving. A lot of hours are lost. So it's a cooperation between the two of us, between the industry, cities, and other kind of players. We should not only do yes, we should. We have to start concrete activities to find business models. Otherwise, nothing will happen.
Erwin, you want to say something about business models? And I just want to ask very quickly to gauge where all of you are sitting. How many of you work with, represent a national government? And how many represent a regional or city government? All right. Go Amsterdam. All right. Erwin.
Yeah, I was recently asked to create like a tech scouting or a tech survey for Nissan in Japan to see how Nissan and any other OEM has the same issues can change its business model. What are they in the end thinking about, and what can be their product? Some of the things that came about is, what can you use a car for? And one of the things is with electric cars, it can become an integral part of your home. If you Google car in home, you see beautiful architectural designs. The car is an amazing system for kids to play in as a game station. It's got steer-by-wire, brake-by-wire, so it has many other usages. If you take that one step further, I mean, if you think of a car as a working space, then you can actually think of it as moving your office. You can have meeting spaces and move that across to an office space where these cars are somehow connected again and create a new type of office environment. So there are many other ways in which car companies and tier one suppliers can play a big role in rethinking how mobility can shape the city. It's not just where we are right now in terms of moving along corridors, but it can actually become a distributed living space with lots and lots of very interesting opportunities.
Tim, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to. I really like I don't think you were that provocative. I think it was a really important statement that you made. One of the things we're going to have to figure
Try
out.
harder next time.
Yeah, be more provocative. One of the things that I think is really important to note is that we're shifting and we're seeing a bunch of shifts, and this will be a transition. Shifts.
Yes.
Yeah, shift.
Just making sure.
Yeah, SHIFT. Transitioning. Let's put it that way. We've got a lot of different transitions, so we're going to see iterations of this happen. Already, there will be a paid ride-hailing service that's level 4 autonomous in the greater Phoenix area later this year with Waymo. They've announced that. I'm not giving you any new news. It's already been announced. So you'll see that there's some experiments, as was mentioned before, that are very small little demonstrations. Demonstrations are relatively easy to do because you set them up and they just have a press day and it's done. Actually providing a service that's reliable and usable is really hard. Trust me, it's really, really hard. So that is a massive moon leap. But that wouldn't have happened, to your point, without that trust and that respect and that relationship that we'd built with the Arizona government and working very closely with them because they want to see something different. They don't have the transit system that everybody else has. They don't have the ride share, the bike share, all those sort of things. They have an 80s style development suburban model, which is very hard to shift. Yes, they made bad mistakes in the 80s, but you can't change that overnight. It's going to take some time to change it. So this is an opportunity now to come in and provide a different type of option and service. I also want to clarify the whole question about, we call them transport network companies, the Ubers and Olas and Grabs and all those different Didis, etc. People think that they actually are a big piece of the transportation piece. They're really still very small. It's an edge. Frankly, it's an edge case. It's 1, 2, 3% of daily total trips. Many of you organize your transportation surveys on how people get around in your regions, and the majority of people in certain countries and certain cities get around by walking, cycling, and transit. Most other cities, it's by driving. The transport network company piece is a couple of percentage points. So while they get all the press, it's actually not as many trips as we think it is. And whether or not they're increasing or decreasing transit use, walking or cycling, it's a continuum. We're going to see blips along the way of increase, decrease, increase, decrease. The same thing will happen with AV technology. It'll increase, decrease, increase, decrease. That's just part of our learnings. And we have to look back at when we introduce new technology in our cities, especially in transportation, we do see these disruptive type patterns. And I think it's important that we have the courage, the patience, and the focus to allow these things to actually grow and morph. Because I think otherwise we're not going to get to those larger, thornier issues that we've been trying to work towards.
Let's get a little more techie now. Let's talk about the human automated driving system interaction question. Again, going forward, do we feel that relationship is one that will change from what it is now? Will the human driver become just a passenger, a passive observer of the system? Or will the human in the vehicle remain an entity with oversight and the potential to interact and control certain aspects of the vehicle when needed? And are there issues? There are issues with that. I know that's a loaded question. Erwin, can you start? What's your vision of the human automated driving system interaction now and what it could be going forward?
Right now, it is identical to how we solve a lot of technological shortcomings with humans in the loop. We basically use the human as a backup. We see it in power plants, we see it in aviation, and now we also see it in driving. The driver, level 3, level 4, level 3 people quickly lose attention. Level 4, they're not necessarily need to be in the loop, but they still need to be ready to take over when the system asks them to do so. People are horrible at that. We know that from 30, 40, 50 years of human factors research, that if you give people something reliable that they need to monitor, their attention goes everywhere. They start daydreaming, they start doing other stuff. And when something critical happens, it can take them seconds, sometimes minutes to get situation awareness and know what's going on. That's great if you have a power plant that is not going to melt down for the next 2 hours, or a plane that's not going to hit the ground for the next minute, but a car could crash in 2 seconds. So asking humans to remain vigilant to the point where they can take over within 2 seconds and save a mistake by the automation is completely impossible. So what we have done, I started a project back in 2000 that led to a product called, internally we called it a magic bumper, which is essentially an active gas pedal that provides you a haptic feedback to a lead vehicle. So essentially the movements of the pedal, the forces on the pedal, tell you what's happening to the gap in front of you. The stiffness of the pedal is related to that space as well. So you can sense, can I still get a little closer? If the system pushes back hard, then you know you're too close. And you feel that very naturally. So people are coupled. They're coupled neuromuscularly, very fast system. And we've compared that system to manual driving as well as ACC driving. And this was in the days where ACC had limitations in terms of at what speed it could work and what curves it could handle, et cetera, et cetera. The switching in and out of automation, if you wish, part automation, people didn't like. They much preferred this haptic gas pedal. Related to that, Frank Flemish in Germany has worked with NASA on this metaphor called the H metaphor, the horse metaphor. And if you go back how we drove essentially autonomously at the turn of the previous century, around the 1900s, we had a horse and buggy. Yeah? We had a horse that had its own eyes and ears, that knew the road, that knew kind of where to go, knew how to avoid stuff, and we were just there along for the ride, and we could give the horse instructions. He translated that absolutely beautifully to automation, where you give people a haptic connection through the steering wheel, as if you have the reins of the car in your hands. So think of loose rein, tight rein. Loose rein is you are attached and you can feel what the automation is doing. Imagine holding somebody's hand and you don't know where to go, and that person is pulling you. All of a sudden that person closes its eyes. You immediately feel that. Yeah? Even though you're trusting the person to take you there, when that person closes its eyes, you immediately feel that. We've done experiments at Delft University of Technology with this type of full automation versus haptic shared control when a system fails in a curve. With automation, everybody flies straight, they don't take over, they crash. With this type of haptic shared control, they occasionally leave the lane, but in most cases people recognize it fast enough and stay within the lane. So with that type of haptic shared control technology, you make the driving task extremely safe. You make the driving task very high performance, and you make the driving task very low workload. All the things you want from an adaptive technology, safety technology. So one of the things I would suggest the role of the human is, in the interim where we have full automation that actually has proven stability and safety, because many of these systems are not self-aware enough of their own limitations. You take an autonomous car and have it drive in northern Minnesota on a snowy road. Is that going to work? Maybe, maybe not, depending on what type of sensor. And humans aren't aware of the limitations of these sensors. So we've developed a symbiotic driving project at Delft University of Technology, where we couple human and machine through active gas pedals, through active steering wheels. So you can actually be guided by the system. You can guide the system. You can correct the system can correct you. So depending on who is most aware, you have this truly symbiotic mutual protection, mutual guidance, mutual learning that works very, very well. More and more OEMs are seeing the potential benefits for that, especially when you go into difficult autonomous areas like inner cities and things like that.
You're starting with the gas pedal, the steering wheel. These are points of interaction already with the vehicle. Going forward, will that change as well, the points of interaction with the vehicle?
That's an interesting one. I mean, we've tried joysticks. Joysticks are great. They improve performance. You have bidirectional control, speed and steering at the same time. But if you look how people use the car, having to have your hands there all the time doesn't allow you to do anything else. And this was before texting, where people might want to pick up a sandwich, or their arm gets tired, and they might rest their hand this way and this way, or maybe look at the map. So these touch points, it's very important that these touch points are actually the control points. So manipulators, steering wheel, pedals, joysticks. We've had very good systems that provide feedback through the seat and provide information where the system is a little bit more assertive and a little bit more salient in terms of its actions. People build up expectations. They have some awareness of the environment, and they expect the seat to do a certain thing. It's not as fast as haptic feedback, but you create that awareness. But the problem there is that if you're not actually driving, people don't maintain awareness of what's going on outside. So ultimately, the goal is full automation, but we're not there yet. But it's also a societal risk. Do we simply accept automation with its failures, knowing that societally there will be fewer casualties as when humans drive? And I think we can reach that point pretty quickly. The question is, do we let machines kill people for reasons that could be prevented? And when do we reach that point that we do release them, we get full acceptance by the society?
And how aligns is that on other policies that governments have adopted, like Vision Zero? Tim, you have just been with a company that took a slightly different approach, fundamentally different in the immediate application, which is to take the human out, except for the test driver, but ultimately take the human out of the driving equation. What was the thinking behind that, and were there limitations, the kinds of limitations that you see now with human-vehicle interaction, things that, as Erwin says, could be overcome in the future and integrated back into these vehicles, or do you think that's not necessary?
Well, I think I made the earlier point that in 2012 we had that kind of technology where there was that requirement to have human interaction, and to Erwin's point before, people were just not paying attention. They were doing their best. These were engineers. Many of the people on the team that I worked with put the rover on Mars. Like, these are not average Joes, right? These are really focused on this stuff. Even they couldn't pay attention to this, because eventually you just get tired. You don't want to do this anymore. You start getting confidence, and your confidence basically allows you to do other things. And so they all made the collective decision that we can't allow this. We really need to separate the person from the driving. And it's going to take longer, and it did take longer. But I think it was an important decision point for the company. What was really interesting, though, is that when we started bringing in the general public into the vehicles, I keep saying we, so remind me, they, because I'm no longer there. So they brought people into the system. We noticed immediate behavior changes, because vehicles to this point are designed around the driver's experience. It's called the dashboard for a reason. The driver needs to see things very quickly and get information very quickly about what's going on in the system, and they can also see around them. Ride-hailing services focus on the passenger experience, and the problem with the current rideshare system is that you don't know what car you're getting into, you don't know what vehicle you're getting into, and frankly, most of the riders actually don't care. And so there's a big fundamental shift there in how things are moving. My parents were brought up with focusing on the car brand and making sure that they got the right brand because it had a status issue with them and friends and family, etc. Most of my friends, I've informally surveyed them saying, what was the last car make you got in at an Uber or Lyft? They have no idea. They just don't pay attention to those sort of things. But they do know that it smelled, or that it wasn't nice, or it was dirty, or that it had a problem with air conditioning, whatever it was. Those sort of things they focus on. So when we brought in the public into our systems, into our service, we noticed that within the first couple of wows, because there's a lot of wow moments, like, oh my gosh, it's actually driving itself. Oh my gosh, it actually took a left turn. It can do all the things that I thought that it couldn't do. After a couple of those wow moments, in 30 seconds of the ride, the eyes go onto their phone. And they're doing this. Because as far as they're concerned, it's taken care of. And that has a lot of opportunities and pluses and minuses, a lot of business models around that to actively use their time, etc. But the decision was that we wanted to have the rider be the focus and have the computer actually do the driving. And so that was a really fundamental change. And what that meant was that we're in that transitional phase right now is that by law we're required to have a vehicle that has a steering wheel, brake, and pedals, but that's basically taken control by the computer. There is a big red button that if you
button.
If you don't like it, you just press the button. But you can always press the stop, and it'll safely pull over. Its default is to basically always slow down and pull over if something does happen. And I think the question that we have here is how much of that will we get there, and how soon we get there. This is in a geofenced area. Like we haven't mapped the world yet. So Google did map the world once, and they have to map it again to allow this to be available everywhere. But it's going to start in geofenced areas first, and you'll be able to have that right experience. In the interim, I think to Erman's point, a lot of those parallels will need to happen. So you can't use these vehicles outside of the geofenced area. So if you do need to go further and beyond, you'll have to use a manually driven vehicle of some sort with some sort of assistance. And so I think that's the big distinction. The fact that the industry is focused on the driver, now they'll be focusing more on the rider, and the rider's experience is going to be a lot different. The preferences for music, climate, positioning, the services around them, the video, all those sort of things have become much more important because the focus can be on that, or the sleeping, business type reclining seats, that sort of stuff for like intercity travel. All those things will become much more apparent as the technology is proven out that it can actually handle those situations more and more and more.
We'll come back to what's happening in the vehicle, because I think that's an interesting question. Certainly, the vehicle, as it moves to this type of automation, level of automation, creates a captive audience, and that's something that's of value for many. Heinrich, can you give, so what you've heard on the human vehicle or automated driving system interaction, some inputs from your experience, and while you're doing that, I'd like to ask the audience to think about some questions that you might have for Tim or for Erwin, and after this, I'll go out to you and we'll take a few questions as well.
So first of all, my company also has some kind of collaborations with Frank Flemish. I know him personally since many, many years from my ISO activities. We have to look to two sides of the coins. Do you know who makes most money in the automotive industry from car brands? Any idea? Who makes most money? So it's brands like Porsche, brands like Ferrari, and so on and so on. And definitely the OEMs, they want to benefit on these kind of drivers. So when talking on human-machine interface, yes, on the one hand, there is the autonomous driving vehicle, but it makes a lot of fun driving on the countryside with a car with a lot of horsepowers. So we don't have to overlook these people who are willing to spend money. And definitely we have to develop solutions in which you can drive by yourself, have fun, and willing to spend money for that. Because yes, there's this young generation who does not want to own their own car.
Can I just stop you right there? And I'll just ask the questions to the audience. Of you that have children that are between 16 for the US and 20 years old for Europe, how many of your children have their license already? Or rather, how many don't have their license? That's a better question. How many young children of yours that are of driving age do not have their license? Okay, so five people. All right.
So the human-machine interface, at the end of the day, the car must understand the situation in autonomous driving mode, in which the driver is. So he needs to understand his healthy condition. He needs to prepare a good environment, climate control. When you come from jogging, then they need to adjust the air temperature in different segments, and so on and so on. At the end of the day, machine learning will come into place, learning in which kind of situation a human or the user feels best. So the system analyzes, let's say, the way how people breathe, the heart, and so on and so on, and then finally adjusts the human-machine interface to the personal needs. People will use these kind of systems only when the interaction with the machine meets a certain expectation, and that's important. The engineers very often forget the driver, but the driver at the end of the day uses the system, and only when the driver acceptance reaches a certain level, then we can sell these kind of systems, and then they are accepted by the driver.
And I think one thing, like Tim said, is that the clients for these systems will be multiple. It may be individuals, it may be fleet operators, it may be freight operators. There's a number of different markets emerging. I'd like to turn to the audience now. Does anyone have a question for either Tim or for Erwin? Here, we'll start with Alistair, and then right to the next table, Tom.
Hi. Firstly, really interesting discussion, so thanks very much for that. I think my question relates to something that's been skirted around. You just asked the question about driving licenses. It seems like it's a generational thing. So we're talking about parents being used to driving, I'm used to driving, but children now interacting in AR, VR environments where they don't need to travel to meet people. How do we tackle that integration? So actually making sure that we can have these autonomous vehicles within our system, making sure that they're shared, but what's the policy and what's the target audience for that policy? So should it be, how do we convert our 30 to 40-year-olds to give up their private cars and move to these type of systems? Or do we accept that the technology could be within the future, that we should be focusing on our children for this type of thing?
Heinrich, you've just made the point that the system has to be really compelling. And Tim, you said earlier that policy has a role in shaping that framework. So where does your feeling in terms of the compellingness of the system versus what policy is put into place to guide the uptake of these types of systems?
Yeah, I think that's the key question. It's like, I think there's a partnership that we haven't really touched upon yet, and that's one of the reasons why myself and a few others started this City Innovate Foundation a few years ago, was to bring in those really hard discussions into a safe space where the government and the industry can actually have these conversations to really figure this out, because you're going to need both sides. You're right, it is a generational thing. It's not going to happen overnight, though, so I wouldn't start calling everybody to give up their car tomorrow, because that, even though I'd love that personally, that's not what's going to happen for most people, because that's not their reality. You are seeing this transition, though, of more people are using app-based services. So, you know, these are the keys for most people who are not driving their own car. You can access bikes, trains, buses, etc., vehicles of what have you. And so they're already accustomed to that layer of abstraction. There's one layer removed from that physical interaction. When someone's driving them, whether it's a car driver in a ride-hailing service or on a bus or a train, they're focusing on their interaction with their social media, whatever it is they're doing. They're working, they're sleeping, they're doing whatever they're doing, right? So we're just going to see more and more and more of that. And the challenge with that is what happens at those intersection points where they are no longer in that protected space and they're vulnerable now and exposed to the actual IRL, in real life, the physical domain. How do they interact with it? Because if everybody's driving, technically driving but looking at their phone, everyone's walking but technically looking at their phone, no one's looking at each other, we need to slow everything right down. Because that means if we bump into each other, it'll be a bump. But if we're still going the speeds that we're going, we're going to have more collisions, and those could be severe. So that's really the interaction between government and industry really needs to start thinking about what's the transition plan over the next decade, because it'll happen over the next decade, where we're going to start seeing more and more and more of this change.
Erwin?
Yeah, it's living in San Francisco, and I recently moved there. The amount of services, as like Tim also said, that are available. If you really take a close look at what it means to own a car, first of all, parking is awful. It's expensive to own a car. It's expensive to park a car. But some of the hurdles that were there, that I need my car to go camping or something like that, or I need my car to move stuff around. There are so many services where you dial it up and you see, okay, there's a pickup truck, half a block down the street that I can rent for the day, and I can pick up my couch. There is or have it delivered. Yes, you can do that. So, you've got the ride share. If you want to go on vacation, you can get a car delivered to your home. You can take that for a few days, leave it at home. Somebody will pick it up. So it becomes very, very seamless. And if I look at my own son, he's 19 years old. Depending on where he's going, he uses, ride shares, he's using Ubers and Lyfts. But he also has a pickup truck because he's a surfer and he's a biker. So when he goes to the mountains, he's got 4 bikes hanging off the pickup truck, a pile of surfboards in there. Who's going to provide that service for him at the moment? That doesn't exist yet. So him and his buddies have that car for that particular purpose, but going to a party or going to the city or even going back home, they leave that car parked and they use these other services. So, as these services mature and people see the flexibility and the economic benefit and the environmental benefit of not owning a car, I think it will happen automatically.
There's the issue of how compelling services built around that or the vehicle itself are raises the question in my mind, do people walk in a highly automated world? And that's part of the transport issue that ministries and regions and cities have to face. Do they walk as much in a highly automated world?
Absolutely. I think they're going to have a lot. I think it's I have to figure out how I'm going to respond this carefully, because there are ways that these changes are going to happen that we're not even aware of today. And while some people say that it's going to be awful, we're going to have people doing 2-hour commutes and that sort of stuff, I just don't see people are reacting that way. So it just depends on how the urban area is made up now. Because the decisions that cities and urban areas make in the next year or two about their infrastructure, about their parking structures, et cetera, will impact them for the next 50, 60 years. So I'm hoping that they're already thinking about it today, or at least in the next year, about building in some flexibility in their infrastructure that they're providing so that these morphs can happen over time. You're going to see push and pull, right? So the central areas or the areas of interest are going to become very intensified because they can. More things can be delivered to them, as everyone's saying, more service can be brought to them. So there are going to be much more intensive areas. There's also going to be a lot more ex-urban areas as well, because these things can bring you to and from certain places. What we found is that even in tech-savvy Bay Area, where everyone wants everything delivered to them, the fundamental human condition of wanting to be social animals and socialize with people means they want to be in places that are really walkable, livable, and interesting. They may be artificially created, but they do like those places over none of those non-places. I haven't seen a place in the world that thrives without those kind of places. So I kind of feel like we're going to see more of those intensified, but we also will see more ex-urban movement as well.
Erwin? And then we'll take 2 questions from this table.
Yeah, I think once you give people time back and the frustrations go away, and you move cars out of large portions of inner cities, people will start walking there, just like Tim said. And we are social beings. There is a real vibe in the city that we want to get, and you don't get that vibe when you're just sitting in your car driving through it. It's mostly frustrating. Whereas if you're actually walking in that buzz with other people that you encounter and interact with, that's what makes cities exciting. So I think people will gravitate towards that, and if that becomes a bigger part of their daily life, rather than in the weekend I go to the city and I walk around a particular neighborhood. But that also requires changing the inner cities to have these walking areas where you can walk and be distracted and talk and not worry about death by car.
It's funny that we have circled full back to what are some fundamental transport policy issues in cities when we started with automation. We have two questions here at this table.
Yes.
And we'll take them both and then.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for all the great insights. My question has to do with the future of mobility, obviously, as automation increases to various levels. At what point do you see the connectivity infrastructure needed to really maximize the automation and connectivity from that perspective? In other words, what do cities and states and federal governments need to be thinking about? Is that a 5G network that's going to be needed to take full advantage of full autonomy? Certainly, there's different levels that we're going to progress through, but to kind of meet up with that in the future, what do you think is going to be needed, and what type of framework are policymakers going to need to kind of put those things in place to take advantage of the technology?
Infrastructure. And next to you, also, there was a question.
Could you mention, please, some of the security benefits and risks, because it's the second part of the topic?
I think those two are quite connected, because with connectivity comes security and cybersecurity risks as well. So what role for connectivity and what limitations are posed by the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of highly connected systems?
Yeah, it's a bit the chicken and egg I talked about earlier. Back in the 1990s, we had fully connected infrastructure. The infrastructure was fully aware of the vehicles. The vehicles would talk to the infrastructure. The vehicles would talk to each other, and you can create a very efficient transport system. Like you mentioned, what penetration rate do you need for that to actually become efficient? I don't know the exact number, but if you purely look at clusters of cars, if you have 30–40% penetration of sensor-equipped cars and the rest communicates, you have a huge benefit all of a sudden for everybody. I mean, imagine somebody who doesn't have an autonomous car but has some sort of transponder, something very easy aftermarket that autonomous cars around them communicate to that car to make them aware of other cars, to make them aware of critical situations, or maybe even to communicate some of its own intentions. So a lot of issues that we currently have with sensor limitations will go away when we have communication. So, looking around corners, having earlier detection of pedestrians walking on a crosswalk between two cars. Humans are very good at that. We can look through windshields. We have clear expectations where that happens. But having some sort of communication of that is a huge impact, huge benefit. In terms of the cybersecurity, it's a huge issue. But recently I've been thinking about it. By having more connectivity and having more redundancy in the system, you have many entities looking at the car looking at itself from many sensors. It can actually have an awareness whether the behavior is consistent. Yeah, so if that behavior isn't consistent, then you take action like pull the car over or something like that. So while it increases the vulnerability, it also creates a redundancy in the system that protects the system essentially against these types of cyber infiltrations.
Heinrich, did you have
So definitely one thing is very clear. Intelligent traffic management is not possible without cloud computing, without cars connected to some kind of interface. Sensors is very important, but there will be new providers providing this intelligent traffic management system, which is supported by new technologies like machine learning, so that the machine understands how to manage the traffic system and how to optimize. It's combined with other kind of sensor technology, like for example intercity NOx or any other kind of measurement on the environment, and then this combination will lead to the answer of your question. There are several European projects ongoing testing exactly that.
Yeah, I think both are very, very good questions, and I think it's important. One of the challenges with government infrastructure is the need to put something in the ground, the need to build something, the need to add something to something. And you may or may not need that stuff. I think depending on the market, it's evolving so fast that you almost want to just observe it and have some test pilots and try some things out without telling you what you can and should be doing. I think one of the areas that I would focus on is building up your data science teams. Many of the teams in these current environments don't have the understanding of how to digest the data, let alone receive the data in a format that actually will work for them. Because companies can give you tons and tons of data, but if you don't actually have to digest it and manage it, you can't make informed decisions. And as policymakers or advisors to policymakers, you need to have the ability to at least communicate and converse at the same level that the company is actually bringing you the data for, because they're going to want you to make decisions based on that data that they're sharing with you or they're giving you or that you're tapping into. So whether it's 5G, 4G, that'll all work itself out. It's cloud-based, etc. The key is no, I'm saying, but whether they have 4G now, some of these entities don't even have 4G. So like when they get to 4, 5, or 6G or 10G, whatever it is, it's going to get there. The private sector will push in that direction. You can actually be part of that discussion. I think it's an important discussion to have, but it's really about, does your team have the wherewithal to actually interact and actually meet with these kind of groups? And on the cybersecurity side, I think it's really important that when you do meet with these companies, you ask a lot of questions. How much redundancy do they have in their systems? How fail-safe are their systems? An example I'll give is with Waymo, the vehicle's computer makes all the decisions in the vehicle. We can't tell it what to do. It makes its decisions in the vehicle. We can suggest things, but it will make the right decision on what it should do. And then if it can't finish its cycle, it asks itself a bunch of questions a couple of thousand times a second. If it can't answer those questions completely, its default is to slow down and pull over and reassess. So 2 computers on board, a bunch of redundant sensors, whether it's cameras, LiDAR, radar, etc., a bunch of different microphones to confirm that it's actually doing what it should be doing. This all happens in a split second, but this is all built-in systems to make sure that the vehicle is actually going to be always safe. And it's what it's designing to do is making sure that the occupants are secure inside, but also that it's making sure that it's secure outside. It's looking out for the people outside and for the people inside. So if you do meet with these kind of companies, you want to ask those kinds of questions. Do they have a safety report? What is their cybersecurity process like? Can you at least see that, or can you at least understand it? Do you have the team internally that can actually review it with them so you can actually see that sort of stuff? These are all questions that would need to pop up so that you can have those really informed discussions, because you will be the platform owners. You own the platform, which is the right-of-way, and these companies will want to test on your right-of-way, and you want to invite them because, to the points made before, you want to get as many of these companies testing and learning and growing so that the system can move forward overall. When you have those processes in place, then the company also feels more comfortable that they actually can really work in your city or in your region. So it's a real partnership. You need to work together to figure this out, and it's going to be iterative. You're going to learn over time on how this works.
You say it's a partnership, but it's also, on the public policy side, a real responsibility.
Absolutely.
To ask the right questions and put in place the right framework. We had a question back here.
Hello, thank you. I'm Geert van Waag from the International Federation of Pedestrians. So far, I was kind of quite optimistic about these autonomous vehicles, because I think some way that I trust them more than you and myself as a driver. But when I heard earlier here the discussion about connected and about sensors and things like that, of course, connected vehicles can talk to each other. But I mean, as a pedestrian, I mean, there was at a certain moment a European project that all pedestrians should wear a kind of a little tag, and if you forget your tag, yeah, sorry. I mean, those kind of things. So can you maybe comment on this whole thing about connected, but about pedestrians especially, and cyclists, and the unreliable behavior of us? And
who has responsibility for being connected?
Yeah,
should that responsibility exist for pedestrians and cyclists?
Personally, I think that we are biologically perfect, and so we don't need any more attachments to ourselves. But we do. We all have one of these, unfortunately or fortunately. And many of the people that don't feel very, very free, but also disconnected. It's kind of interesting. I think it's up to the technology, frankly, to adapt itself to today's and tomorrow's cities, not the other way around. I think that's a very difficult thing because each city is going to be different, and companies cannot trust that the connectivity in one city will work in the next city, and there may be latency issues, there may be problems with the cloud that morning or day. GPS doesn't work half the time, so there's a whole bunch of issues. Who's trying to have a video conference call and doesn't work half the time? So imagine that times 10. So until we have that super duper 5+G network in place, in between, the companies really should be doing this stuff themselves. Machine learning has the ability and has shown that it can detect and understand all types of movements. I mean, Waymo's technology, for example, understands pedestrian movements for how they're going to physically, the signals to right, left, etc. Even if they don't make those signals, you can understand how the bicycle handlebar will steer. So all of those things are available in a machine learning context. The question is, should we affix sensors to these things, or should we have the vehicle be a little bit more demonstrative, as Erwin was saying, about what's its intention? So some companies are thinking about putting LCD screens on the vehicles with its intent, like I'm stopping now, I'm going to be making a right turn, I'm picking up and dropping off passengers, I'm exiting and entering a certain space. Those are all things that we can look at too. I think the question is that in the order of hierarchy, vulnerable road users are our highest priority, and then everything else comes after that.
Erwin, a few words on where the responsibility for being connected lies?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, if you have enough sensors and enough connectivity between the vehicles, they can observe the pedestrians and essentially react to the pedestrians. But that's kind of the model we have right now. Daimler has this system where it can actually detect the orientation of a pedestrian walking to the edge of the road and the head post, and it warns and stops depending on the intent of the pedestrian. But that all assumes that there are corridors where cars move and bicyclists move, and there are pedestrians that try to cross that occasionally. If you look at, if everything were actually human, if cars had the expressive power of a human, you would have a very different interaction. You would immediately get that intent, and right now it's just way too slow. Cars don't really communicate, and beautiful studies have been done in University of California, San Diego, trying to get a sense of to what degree are pedestrians actually aware of an autonomous car, and particularly whether there's a person inside the autonomous car. This was an experiment where a driver was sitting in the seat, completely blocked, so when you look at it from the outside, there is no driver, even though they're steering like this. People don't really look at the cars as long as the cars have a behavior that is expected, like slow down early, and this was at a crosswalk, and stop far enough from the crosswalk. If that behavior gets broken, that's when negotiation and interaction between two humans occurs. But there is also this need, I think, to create a communicative autonomous fleet that by doing so, we'll be able to interact with other road users, and particularly vulnerable road users, in a much more fluid fashion. Right now, it is way too separated.
We're right up at the end. Heinrich, you had something to say, and then I've got a last question for the audience and for you. And then
yes. So I do not agree that each can do their own kind of interface. We need to have some kind of standardization. This means we are not allowed to repeat the mistakes we have made with the connectors for electrical vehicles. It will delay this
the charging connectors.
Yeah. The charging connectors, yes, the charging connectors. As an example, we have started international standard for valet parking. And one part of the standardization is what kind of messages we exchange between the parking infrastructure and the vehicle. It must be ensured that each and everybody can talk to the different stakeholders. That's a must. So all the stakeholders, and you are one of the stakeholders, you must be part of these development activities. And I really encourage you to take the chance to bring in your needs, to discuss with industry, to discuss with suppliers, with institutes, and so on and so on.
We're right at the closing time. I have one question for everyone in the room, including our speakers, and it pertains to those people who have actually ridden in a highly automated vehicle, so a vehicle that goes beyond lane keeping assist. How many of you have done that? A small set, and all three of you have.
Hundreds of miles.
Hundreds of miles. So okay, well, you'll be the outlier. Of those people who have driven in a highly automated vehicle, when you first entered and drove in that vehicle, were you thinking about the past? Oh my gosh, this changes the way transport has been organized. Were you thinking about the present? This is amazing. Or were you thinking about the future? What does this mean? So how many of you were thinking about the past? How many of you were thinking about the future? And how many of you were thinking about that present moment? Okay. I think that is a challenge, because that is the compelling nature of any technology, which is to think about, oh my God, this is possible. And what I challenge all of you, and I think what we've heard from our speakers today, is that we don't lose track of the past, and we do keep in mind the future when we think, when we negotiate, when we put in place policies, when we build laws and a framework for automated driving, that we keep in mind the future, and more important than all of that, we keep in mind that there are always going to be humans in that mix, as inhabitants in those cities where these vehicles will be operating, as potentially passengers in these vehicles, and people that will get value from this technology, but not only from this technology. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Erwin. Thank you, Heinrich, for your lesson, if you will, for the insights that you've given, for the brain dump that you've allowed us to have an insight into. Feel free to talk to them afterwards, but can we have a big hand of applause for them? All right. Thank you very much, and we're all available for questions afterwards. Have a good rest of the summit.